What kind of mind turns starvation into a weapon? Genghis Khan did. Known as the Great Khan of the Mongols, he didn't just conquer cities, he weaponized hunger itself. His armies didn't storm the gates right away. Nope, they surrounded cities, sealed them off, and waited. Days turned into weeks, weeks stretched into months. Inside, people watched bread crumble to dust, rats disappear, and the dead quietly consumed. In 1219, when he invaded the Khwarezmian Empire, he besieged the great city of Nishapur. The Mongols blocked every food supply, poisoned wells, and built an unbreakable perimeter. This wasn't desperation, it was strategy. Engineers calculated exactly how long a city's provisions would last, waiting until desperation broke their defenders. Some cities surrendered without a sword drawn. Others resisted and faced horrors even worse. And this was just the beginning. The Mongols didn't stop at starvation. They redefined terror, conquest, and the fate of anyone unlucky enough to fall into their path. Women, children, nobles, no one was spared from the psychological and physical nightmare Genghis Khan unleashed. What happened next will shock you, and it gets darker than you ever imagined.
So here's where it all starts. Genghis Khan wasn't just a warrior. He was a strategist whose mind turned hunger into a weapon of terror. His armies didn't just rush cities like a normal invading force. Instead, they surrounded them, completely cutting off all supplies. And then they waited, and I mean waited, weeks, sometimes months, until desperation became unbearable. You can imagine the scene inside, people tearing at scraps, rats disappearing from the streets. And eventually, even the dead were no longer safe from starvation-driven hunger. Take Nishapur in 1219. Genghis Khan's army laid siege, but the walls were strong, and a quick victory was impossible. So the Mongols went full methodical mode. Every food route blocked, wells poisoned, and a perimeter established so tight that no one could get in or out. This wasn't some random cruelty. Mongol engineers had the math down. They calculated exactly how long provisions would last inside the city, patiently waiting for the moment when despair would shatter the defenders' will. Some cities surrendered before a single sword was lifted. Others resisted and faced horrors beyond imagining. Persian chronicler Juvayni, who documented these campaigns, describes Merv as a city where starvation was so severe that people ate leather, grass, and eventually even the corpses of the dead. He wrote, "None remained to bury the corpses, and the dogs feasted on the flesh of the faithful." That's not just a horror story. It's psychological warfare on a terrifying scale. But here's the kicker. When the gates finally fell, mercy was never part of the plan. Survivors, skeletal, broken, barely recognizable as human, were either slaughtered or enslaved. Genghis Khan's goal wasn't just victory. It was to send a message. Resist, and you don't just die, you suffer, slowly, helplessly, and utterly humiliated. And that's when the real story begins. The fate of those captured, especially women, reveals just how far Genghis Khan's empire would go to dominate everything in its path.
Picking up from the devastation inside those cities, the story gets even darker. Genghis Khan wasn't just after land, he was after total control, and that included people. After the sack of Bukhara in 1220, thousands of women and girls were captured. It wasn't random. There was a chilling, methodical system. The higher the soldier's rank, the more prestigious the women they received. Noble women often ended up with Mongol generals or even Genghis Khan himself, while lower-ranking women were sent into forced labor, menial tasks, or worse, Juvaini, the Persian chronicler, paints a grim picture. After a city fell, men were separated from women, children from their mothers, and the captives were driven into camps like literal herds of sheep. And it wasn't just survival, it was about power, dominance, and humiliation. Women were ranked, paraded, and chosen based on age, social status, and beauty. Being beautiful? That became a curse. Many ended up as concubines, a stark statement that Mongol conquest erased the legacy of their families. Some women were forced into marriage within Mongol households, while others were sold across the empire, from Central Asia all the way to the Yuan court in China. Most lost their identities entirely, renamed, repurposed, and forgotten. Only a handful, if any, kept even a fragment of their previous lives. Genghis Khan's empire wasn't just about conquering cities, it was about reducing people to property, and the women bore the brunt of this. Their suffering was systematic, deliberate, and became one of the darkest legacies of the Mongol path to empire. But here's where it gets even more brutal. Some captives were used in ways that turned them into living shields, a terrifying tactic that literally put civilians in the line of fire.
Picking up from the fate of captured women, it gets even terrifying. Genghis Khan didn't just enslave people, he weaponized them. One of his most ruthless tactics was using civilians as human shields. This wasn't a chaotic battlefield decision, it was deliberate, cold, and calculated. Captured townsfolk, often women, children, and the elderly, were forced to march ahead of Mongol troops straight into enemy defenses. Their bodies absorbed the first volleys of arrows, exhausting the defenders' firepower and spreading panic. One of the most infamous examples happened during the siege of Gurganj in 1221. As the city's resistance stiffened, Genghis Khan ordered thousands of captives to march in front of his army. Some were tied together to prevent escape, others made to dig trenches, haul supplies, or fill moats, all while under enemy fire. If they survived, their lives often ended anyway. The Mongols preserved captives not for mercy, but to maximize terror. Persian historian Juvaini described this with chilling precision. They used the people of one city to batter down the next. It was industrial-scale horror, a psychological hammer aimed not just at the enemy, but at anyone watching what happened to their neighbors, friends, and family. This wasn't just about killing, it was about breaking spirits. Entire populations learned that resisting Mongol forces could mean watching loved ones die in front of them, forced into impossible positions, or used as expendable tools. To the Mongols, war wasn't governed by honor or mercy. It was total domination. Entire cities, entire populations were pawns in a horrifying strategy of conquest. And just when you think it couldn't get more terrifying, the Mongols didn't even need swords to deliver punishment. Some executions were designed to kill slowly, publicly, and with maximum humiliation.
Human shields. The Mongols' cruelty didn't stop there. Sometimes they didn't even use swords. After crushing a coalition of Rus princes and their Tupchak allies at the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, the survivors weren't executed in a straightforward way. Nope. Genghis Khan's generals Subutai and Jebe turned punishment into a grotesque performance of dominance. Captured nobles like Mstislav of Kiev were laid face down in the dirt. Then, in an utterly calculated spectacle, Mongols built a huge wooden platform on top of them. A lavish feast followed. Mongol commanders drank, ate, and celebrated right above the nobles' slowly suffocating bodies. It wasn't quick, it wasn't clean, but it was precise. By the time the banquet ended, the princes' lives were gone, their bodies crushed, and their dignity obliterated. This method wasn't just about killing.
It was psychological warfare in its purest form. By turning death into a horrifying display, the Mongols sent a crystal-clear message. Defiance didn't just end in death. It ended in humiliation and terror, witnessed by anyone smart enough to take notes. And there's a reason for this particular cruelty. Mongol tradition sometimes forbade spilling noble blood directly, so they found a method that was both brutal and technically bloodless. The spectacle reinforced their reputation. They didn't just win battles, they erased memory, legacy, and honor. But here's the twist. These public executions weren't random. Some punishments were reserved for betrayal, sending messages even more pointed than the battlefield horrors.
Picking up from the terrifying spectacles of the battlefield, Genghis Khan also had punishments specifically reserved for betrayal, one of the most infamous being tied to the back of a horse and dragged until death. This wasn't some chaotic or random act. It was a targeted, deliberate punishment for defectors, spies, or governors who betrayed his trust. In Mongol law, treason wasn't just disobedience, it was a direct threat to the empire's stability, and it demanded a public, irreversible response. The execution was brutal and calculated. Victims had their hands bound, sometimes limbs dislocated to prevent resistance, then they were lashed to a horse. At the signal, the animal was spurred forward. The victim was dragged across uneven terrain, often for long distances. And death didn't come instantly. It could take minutes, even longer, depending on the ground. The goal wasn't just death, it was terror. Anyone who saw it understood the stakes of defiance. Historical records from Central Asia and the Middle East confirm that this method was a standard response for rebels or treacherous governors. The Mongols didn't need extended spectacles. The brutality spoke for itself. A mutilated, dragged body left in front of city walls sent a permanent, chilling warning. Betray the Khan, and this is your fate. This punishment was rooted in Genghis Khan's strict code, the Yassa, which demanded absolute loyalty. Every execution, every public death reinforced the order of the empire. It wasn't chaos. It was a message carved into flesh, meant to echo across generations. Genghis Khan's empire didn't just conquer land. It dismantled entire worlds and rewrote the rules of power through fear, discipline, and ruthless justice. And even after all this horror, his legacy was summed up perfectly by Juveni. They came, they sapped, they burnt, they slew, they plundered, and they departed.